All right, so I'm going to try going back from my last video in which I talked about divine simplicity and offer a quick summary of our class during the first week. Now, the reason I want to do this is because, as it should probably be already clear from talking about divine simplicity, and as we're going to later talk about the Trinity and about the hypostatic union, it's very important for those conversations to be clear about what we mean by God, what we mean by the necessary being, and what we mean especially when we say that God is pure act and his essence is his existence, and all of these things which will certainly fall out of the doctrine of divine simplicity. And this is interesting because some theologians will actually work from divine simplicity first, and then from divine simplicity they will argue for that God's essence is his existence. Other theologians will start with God's essence is his existence, and therefore divine simplicity. St. Thomas does both, depending on what you're reading. In his Summa Contra Gentiles, he starts with God's essence and his existence and moves from there. He starts from divine simplicity and then moves from there to his essence and his existence. In his Summa Theologiae, he does the exact reverse. And in his De Ente et Essentia, which we read part of in class, he doesn't touch so much on divine simplicity, although he hints at it a couple of times. And so he's able to build this doctrine from a number of different vantages. And so that's important to recognize. This isn't just something that can be put together in one way, but there are multiple ways of actually examining the truth that this is. And this has been seen as a fundamental pillar of Christian theology for many, many generations. Certainly roots of it can be seen as far as back as once Christians start very clearly articulating the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, the doctrine of creation out of nothing. It becomes very clear that whatever we mean by God, we don't mean something that exists in the created order, right? If God is something that exists in the created order, that means someone had to have created him, or something had to have created him. And whatever that thing that created him, that is really, truly what we mean by God. And so there's this regress problem, which brings up an interesting dichotomy that St. Thomas actually points at. He starts with the assumption that there is something exists. And I think that's actually a defensible position that you can prove. Beyond shadow of doubt, there is something that exists. Now, that's not the purpose of this course. That's much more in lines of Cartesian philosophy. And as much as I'm not a fan of some of Descartes' later works, I do think that he is right on actually being able to say we can prove our existence. Although I'm skeptical of that kind of manner of building a larger theology. We'll get to that later. However, for St. Thomas, he wants to say, if something exists, then either everything is caused by another thing. I am caused by my parents, who are caused by their parents, who at one point were caused by something else or something else. And these would talk both about instrumental causes and principal causes. For example, I might be the instrumental cause of a table if I was to build a table. If I was to take up carpentry, learn how to build a table, I could be the instrumental cause, or I could be the principal cause of that table. But the tools that I would use to build the table, those would be the instrumental causes. I would be the principal cause because I'm the one doing it, but I'm not doing it by myself. I'm doing it with the help of instruments, such as a saw, such as hammer, things like that. And so both of us are causes, but both of us are causes in different ways. Now, ultimately, we could say that everything just boils down to instrumental and principal causes of other things. The difficulty with that is you have a regress problem. And a regress problem, that means that nothing can actually come into act. Why? Because there was something prior to that act that was in act already. And the interesting thing here, too, is that this doesn't just refer to time. St. Thomas, and I would agree with him on this, says that if God wanted to, he could have created an eternally existing universe, one that never had a beginning or an end, but was distinct from God and was a created thing. That's logically possible. So what St. Thomas is talking about here is not simply that something has to have a chronological cause. He's saying instead that something must have an instrumental or a principal cause in order to have act at all, and that this principal causing could not go back infinitely. And a helpful illustration, a helpful analogy of this would be, again, if I had an infinitely deep pit in my classroom, and 5 feet below that pit, I would begin unrolling a ladder, like a rolling ladder, and I would begin unrolling it until it hit the bottom, in which case I would start pulling it up so that way it could go up towards the ceiling. It would never have anything to ground it to actually come out of the bottomless pit, so long as I didn't actually, hold it up. That's similar to the problem that happens when we have principal and instrumental causes that have an infinite regress. There's no reason that anything should actually have act ever, and therefore nothing can have act now. Now, the other solution to this is to say, well, there is one cause which is itself its own cause. And so that might sound like, oh, well, of course, certainly we're talking about God right there. But here's the important thing, is once we've said that, once we've recognized that God is his own cause, we have to ask, well, what's the type of thing that can be its own cause? And this is indeed a very special type of thing. And here I'll use some impersonal language, but I want to be clear that in using some impersonal language, I'm doing so more for linguistic sensibility, because it can be a little difficult to talk about the thing that is its own cause, and then also recognize that is God, whom I'm going to use he language for, right? Third person language for, because we know that this own cause is not just some sort of abstract entity, but instead is a personal cause. We'll get to how that makes sense in the forthcoming or the upcoming sections of this class. But if God is his own cause, we know that what it means to be God is fundamentally different from what it means to be anything else. Namely, that for all other things, I could differentiate between a thing's existence, that it is, and its essence, or what it is. I can differentiate between what a thing is and that a thing is. The that is what we call essence, or part of it is what we call existence. Sometimes we call being, not a being, but being itself. Even we might refer to it as like ends, being the E-N-S, right? The what a thing is, though, or the nature, the essence, the quiddity, the whatness of it, right? Those are distinct in all created things. I can even think of some things that have a quiddity, a whatness, and nature and essence, but don't have any existence. That might be, again, a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Certainly those used to exist, but they don't exist right now, that we know of at least. Let's assume they don't exist. Perhaps there's a planet out there somewhere that has a Tyrannosaurus Rex running around, and we just don't know that yet. But let's assume that there aren't actually any. And we said that has an essence, a whatness, but it doesn't have a thatness, not right now at least. Similarly, I could imagine a creature like a leprechaun or a dwarf, by this I mean like the mythological dwarf, right, that has never had an existence, but we could still talk about its whatness. So those two are distinct things. But if something is a necessary being, that means its thatness is included in the definition of what it is. And this makes an interesting and very tight little circle there. That means in order to talk about what that thing is, since in its nature includes its existence, we also have to talk about that the thing is. Once we have a necessary being, that means that its existence is included and it's one with its essence. In other words, God's essence is his existence. Now, that doesn't mean that anything that exists is God, right? That would be pantheism or panentheism, perhaps. And that's certainly not a Christian doctrine. No, it's very distinct from that. And in order to understand how it's distinct from that, we're going to need to talk about the analogy of being. The analogy of being is a very core concept for Thomas Aquinas, one that a lot of people still wrestle with to this day, but one that I think has to be the case. Otherwise, we end up with something like pantheism. And so in the next video, I will talk about what that analogy of being is and how we should understand it.